Hello, hello, hello! We Brits have long defined ourselves in opposition to the continent, a point of national pride. Yet, after decades of globalisation, cheap flights and membership in the EU, it appears that a large proportion of our people now consider themselves to be no more different to continental Europe than Germany is to France. Here is every way in which this is utterly wrong, and why we absolutely must remain separate from the continent. Also, I wish to ground this discussion in the ideas of statism versus devolved authority. This will become clearer as I go, but for now it suffices to say that the continental Europeans tend to want almost fascist-like state authority, whereas Britain has a far more organic devolved system under the authority of the Crown. Anyway, without further ado, let's get into it. Firstly, there are a number of largely superficial ways in which Britain is visibly different from the continent. We drive on the left, we have Type G plugs and sockets, we natively speak the lingua franca of the world, we left the EU, and we have the English Channel. Now, of course, these are lesser issues. What matters most to us is how we have developed culturally, institutionally, and in terms of identity. Is there any greater example in the history of the world of such an unmitigated disaster as continental European philosophy, especially since the French Revolution? As David Starkey famously says,
all bad ideas are French.
German too, by the way. To be perfectly honest, I am a bit out of my depth talking about the nuanced idiocy of continental philosophy, and I recommend you learn about it elsewhere as well, but the general trend from the continentals is a complete failure to understand human nature, the arrogant belief that people can be bent to the state's will, and an utterly mad desire for totalitarian control and authority. But anyway, the French Revolution, disaster. Socialism, disaster. Fascism, disaster. Sex positivity, disaster. Wokeness, which is built on Marxism, disaster. Every disastrous ideology we have seen in the last 100 years or so is either from the continent or very clearly derived from something else that is. Even the continental liberals make the classic mistake of assuming that different peoples from different religious and cultural backgrounds are effectively interchangeable. They're not. To be fair, our liberals do make the same mistake as well. In Britain, however, we have had a notably different set of ideas. All the way back in 1215, when the terrible King John II was in charge, the nobility forced him to sign the Magna Carta, enshrining their rights to property and limiting the king's previously absolute power. This set a precedent of reform, limiting the power of monarchs and gradually allowing that power to be held first by the nobles, then by the common people. For this reason, more than any other, England's political philosophy is not about totalitarian control or naive idealism, but about rights and reform. Even when the suffragette terrorists were blowing up shops and post boxes, they were doing so to become incorporated into the system, not to overthrow it. The Europeans, however, have not really had any sort of long history of gradual reforms and transfers of power. For them, it is a history of absolute rule and revolution, neither of which are conducive to good governmental policy or institutional structure. I don't know about you, but I think it's imperative that we reject the madness of European philosophy and stick to our own, never again letting a revolutionary like Blair or Starmer back into office. But that's generally how it is with Europe. For them, everything is within the state and nothing outside the state. I mean, even the way we consider language is wholly different. In English, as in any other language, there are many regional dialects, words and accents. So too does our language change over time. Does the state try to oppose this? No. In England, language is observed, not prescribed, and if enough people are using language in a certain way, that way is considered legitimate. The power lies with the people, and the dictionaries are made by universities, not the state. In France, however, it is the opposite. The entire French language is prescribed by the French Academy, and what they say goes. If the people disagree, then tough shit. Half the country could be phrasing things a certain way, but unless the French Academy approves it, it's considered incorrect. There, the power lies with the state, not the people. This is just one example in which the continental European mindset, a mindset of absolute state authority, is so starkly different to our own. Then you have law. The common law legal system is nothing short of miraculous. For those who don't know, in common law, the government does still make laws, of course, but wherever a grey area arises, as they naturally would, it is the decision of the jury or judge in that case that sets the precedent for any similar such case in the future. One quintessentially British example of this is the case of the swans. To keep the story short, one person had promised another person the right to a number of swans along with some land. However, despite any codified law on the matter, it was decided by the people that wild animals in a free state of nature cannot be considered someone's property. As such, the swans could not be considered as belonging to the landowner, and thus could not legally be transferred to the landowner. This judgment now applies to any other case that might arise relating to the possession or right to wild animals in a free state of nature. I don't know about you then, but I quite like the fact that in common law, whilst the legislature still does its thing, power does remain in the judgment of the regular men and women of the jury. If some Mayfair banker is trying to rip off some geezer over a contract dispute, it might just be the judgment of dear old John and Edith in 1863 that our geezer relies on to win his case. On the continent, however, and in much of the rest of the world, they only have civil law, wherein all laws come from the state authority. Wherever a grey area or loophole arises, it needs to be written into codified law. There is no room for the precedent set by the judgment of ordinary folk. All is within the state and nothing is outside the state, a common theme with how continentals view power and authority. We are not the same. For us, ultimately authority does derive from the crown. However, multiple different institutions operate independently of each other, and the crown no longer really exercises the power it officially has. I mean, for example, the military is not controlled by the government. Yes, the government controls their budget and things like this, but military operations are independent. Same with the language. The government does not control the language. That's decided by the universities observing real people. And the same too with the courts or the prisons. These are not government-controlled institutions, but independent institutions operating under Crown authority, rather than state authority. The same was also true of the police. Although this is, again, failing, it used to be that our police were an independent organisation operating under Crown authority, but historically not influenced by politicians. I lament that this is changing now, as the police increasingly look to politicians for guidance, but they used to be operating by themselves, not under the thumb of the state. Whereas, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's no such precedent for that in continental Europe. They're all state police in Europe, especially in the republics. Though these days religion plays a diminishing part in our lives, the effect it has had on our culture is undeniably massive. And whilst the continent has its own varieties of religion, Protestantism, Catholicism, Orthodoxy, England is unique in that we created our own religion, which solely serves the interest of our people. Naturally, most people are familiar with the story. When Henry VIII's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, failed to produce a male heir, he asked the Pope to allow him to divorce her. Instead, the Pope denied him, so, citing the divine right of kings, he broke away from Rome and established the Church of England, with himself as its divinely appointed leader. That's all long gone history now, but what's important today is that since then, England has had its own church under monarchical leadership. The Church of England has, for centuries, guided English culture and served English culture, including our attitudes, values, behaviour and traditions. For example, the abolitionist movement in Britain was led largely by the Church of England, who viewed it as an affront to the idea that all humans are equal under God. Whilst the Church is today a woke-captured national embarrassment, it was a glorious institution in its heyday, and one that served us incredibly well. The Continentals have their own churches, of course, but the Catholics are led by Rome, the Orthodox led by Russia, and the Protestants seemingly not led at all. I mean, this whole idea of crown authority is a fantastic feature of British constitutional arrangement. All these institutions loyal to the same crown, which doesn't exercise any power of its own, but not able to be controlled by one individual or tyrannical prime minister. Lastly, and very importantly, we Brits have a vastly different history. Since arguably the end of the 7 Years' War until after the Suez Crisis, Britain has had a dominant colonial empire. We still have the culturally British sister nations of Canada, Australia and New Zealand. We still have ties with the Commonwealth, and we have built our identity around the idea that we are the mother country of a great and glorious empire spreading the light of civilization, industrialization, rule of law and global trade protected by the Royal Navy. Even now, as America is the one to rule the world, many Brits consider ourselves to be the mother country of America and consider ourselves to have a special relationship with them, the world leader. I personally think we're fools to consider ourselves in some glorious joint venture with America. They've done nothing but abuse us, really, but that's a debate for another time. And look, I could labour the point of history to no end, but I think everyone understands that for centuries our place has been at the centre of a vast colonial empire, essentially leading the world, with Britain long standing separate from continental Europe. It's simply not natural for us to be subsumed into a continental world order not of our making. Now, I don't know if there's any hope to return to something like the empire we had before. His Majesty does still control the domains of New Zealand, Australia, Canada, Belize, Tuvalu, Jamaica and many more, and potentially we have ideas of Kanzuk or a union of the crowns, but at the moment we're struggling to even maintain our own identity within our own country. Who knows what future we will be able to carve for ourselves. In Europe, however, their history is vastly different. To an extent, they have also had the history of being great powers, colonial empires, and so on. But for much of Europe, the idea was domestic territorial expansion, rather than world building. Most important for much of Europe, however, nation-states have not even been a thing for too long. Germany was massively divided. Italy too was divided. The unification of these countries has come very late in the global perspective of things. They've also had massive instability caused by the various types of socialism or revolutionary thought. One could argue that the Scandinavians have had a much more stable go at things, but certainly most of Europe has been under socialist, fascist, nationalist, socialist or communist oppression. These revolutionary mindsets have been a disaster for the continent. And bizarrely, many of the current governmental structures of Europe are, in the grand scheme of things, very new. You could say the United Kingdom too is a fairly new country, unifying in 1707. But realistically, what happened there was Scotland being subsumed into England, primarily based upon English structure. But yeah, I'm hoping I'm making the point clearly that Europe and Britain have very different histories. Their histories and philosophies have been far more unstable, and they're really in no position to tell the world how to rule itself. Anyway, I hope I've made it clear how we are not like the continent and would do well to remember our differences. It is sad for me to see people increasingly identify more with Europeanness than Britishness, and the unavoidable fact is that as our leaders continue to utterly ruin this country, and as the radical left-wing activists infiltrate and infect our institutions, our unique differences are diminishing. I lament also that we are under the economic thumb of America. Any Englishman who has a favourable view of the history of our relationship with America is a fool. The so-called special relationship is nothing but abusive, and we would do well to remain distinct from American culture too. The people on my side of the matter may not have much money, and we may not have institutional power, but what we can and must do is remember the things that made us great and made us unique, and pass this knowledge down to the younger generations as best we can. If we can at least preserve the idea of a glorious Britannia, then we might one day hope of resurrecting her. Anyway, I'm sure I've missed some things out, and I've certainly been sparse on details here and there, so by all means write in the comments whatever you think is important. In any case, thanks for watching, and God save the King.